Hello everybody, welcome. Deeply appreciate all of you who listen to my channel, and I'm very grateful for this time to learn and share and grow together. It's a Friday evening, and I'm taking a walk at sunset. Last night the moon was full and truly beautiful. I have a few topics in mind. And I'm not sure which of them I'll pursue. Maybe I'll start with an insight I had some months ago about evolutionary time and organismal adaptation. So I've spoken in many previous videos about the nature of time as it relates to organisms, but also as it relates to physics. And one of the things I'm trying to learn how to show people in a way that they'll actually have the realization is that organisms are a mode of time-space, right? So in our thinking, which is almost certainly wrong, time-space is the fundamental principle. When we use the word the universe, the phrase, we pretend, that there's just one universe. That's why we use the word the. And also, we tend to think of time within that universe as flat. We have the same problem in thinking about time that we used to have, and some, I guess, still have, thinking about space as it relates to the surface of the Earth. So, apparently, and we're not sure of this, there must have been exceptions. Most of our ancestors, if they were even capable of thinking about the world, and that was pretty challenging because there wasn't news and electronic media and worldwide war and all of these things, so the world was probably understood as our place of being, the place where we are. And more than likely it was understood as a reflection or a child of the sky. In other words, even many of our distant ancestors probably thought of the sky as our origin. But we have the same problem with time. We think in flat time. We think about time as if there's just one process, just one observer, just one timeline, and this is formally impossible. It's a sometimes useful convenience, but it's so blinding that the results of thinking this way pretty much deny us any possibility of understanding, insight, or intelligence. So when we measure a year on Earth, even though we know there are around 8 billion unique human experiences of 1 year, which should be 8 billion human life years, we think about 1 year. The Earth goes around the sun one time. We call that 1 year. Now, of course, the sun is dragging the Earth through interstellar space and intragalactic space. So the Earth is actually making a spiral, not a circle. The sun is dragging the planets through time-space. As they orbit the sun, they make a nested array of spirals, if we were to follow their world lines. So, organisms, just like stars, planets, black holes, white holes, nebulae, quasars, pulsars, dark matter, dark energy if they exist, solar nurseries, these are all modes, localized modes of time-space. The sun is a very special local mode of time-space. And by that I mean the qualities inherent in time-space, in the universe, produce stars naturally, right? They just blossom out of gas clouds and accretion phenomena. They eventually acquire enough gravity to ignite, and now you have something like the sun. And it, over time, probably gathers planets. Planets may form out of accretions. We're not sure about all this. It's possible they occasionally capture interstellar planets, if there are such things. And over time, each of the planets becomes a local mode of time-space, as do their moons and other phenomena. But us Earthlings are trained to think anthrocentrically, as if humans are the only important thing, and a totally separate thing from everything else, which is, of course, not possible. Whatever might be true, it cannot be that. From any perspective with which that is true, most of the information has been torched. Most of the useful information. So what you have down here are extremely rare and unimaginably precious examples of what time-space forges of its own body on living planets like ours. And so each of these organisms that you see, and also the physical objects, these are modes of time-space. Only humans make artificial objects, machines and tools and so forth, and that'll become important later. But for now, let's just think about world lines and organisms. So let's say we have a planet that can support them, and we put two cells, single cells, that can survive on this world in our little model, on this planet, and we'll put them on opposite sides of the planet just for fun. The planet itself has a world line through time, which is planet-shaped. It looks like a tunnel, and it looks like, if the sun is the central locus, it looks mostly like an ellipse, its orbit. If interstellar space is the focus, it traces a spiral as it follows the sun. And if the moon is orbiting the Earth, then the moon makes a second spiral around it in time. It's moon-sized, it's moon-shaped. It's like a tunnel that is all the positions of the moon over time. And inside that tunnel is where the interesting stuff happens. So, because all the moon-like events occupy the interior of that tunnel, right? The atomic processes, the molecular processes, the geological processes, as well as any interactions outside the moon, relationally, with life, or inside the moon, if life goes and lives in the moon. So in most of time-space, you have no organismal events per second, 0. In any cell, you have trillions of organismal events per second, probably. A vast, astonishing number. And inside that cell, you have a special bubble of time-space, in time-space, producing biological, metabolic intelligence. And so, if we trace the world line of a cell from its origin to its endpoint, or wherever we snip the line off, we get a cell-shaped, sized tunnel in time. And that tunnel is absolutely unique to that cell. It's the only tunnel like that there is, even if there are many cells, right? Each of these tunnels can be reasonably understood to be something really astonishing. First of all, a time thread, a time, size, shape, nature thread. So in this case, a cell thread. And you get all of the events that occur inside the cell and outside the cell that the cell relates with. So you get this matrix of temporalities in this little cell-sized package. And the cell literally produces forms of time by molecular, atomic, and perhaps quantum mechanical activity. Right? Inside that cell, it's nothing like the events that are going on in deep space, or even the space right outside the Earth. So you get this little tunnel-like tube of cell events over time. And if you have two of them on a planet, and the planet goes around the sun, that is 2 cell years, presuming that cells experience time at approximately the same rate as a human, which is unlikely. Most likely for single cells, time is accelerated dramatically, such that a minute may be equivalent to a month or even a year for a cell. Different organisms have different temporal rhythms, rates, and activities. So they literally invent, through those activities and the cycling of them, they invent new forms of time, both by existing and relating with all the other organisms. So what you have here on Earth is a situation with billions of very advanced organisms. Earth has been stable for a long evolutionary time. And 1 second here on Earth is an unimaginable amount of biorelational activity. So the Earth in time represents a unique kind of hyperstructure that most likely is connected with many other living worlds through a transport we are as yet unaware of. I could suggest such transports. But I'll skip that for the moment. All right, so you've got a really unusually stable living planet with a lot of liquid water, billions of organisms, all experiencing time uniquely. Each one is a thread in a mesh. That mesh is the hyperstructure in time of their relationships. Maybe that'll make sense to some of you. The simple takeaway is that for each organism produces modes of time by its activities. Right? When you are drinking water, that is a mode of time for your body, the receiving of the water, like there's an organism there drinking water, right? And as the water distributes through your body, that's a mode of time. The things your cells do with the water, that's a mode of time. If you're driving a car, it's a different mode of time from reading a book. Your brain is structured differently and is doing different things when you drive a car and read a book. All those things we do, those are modes of time, right? They're forms of time. And you don't get them without biologies, right? You get a lot of important foundational aspects of time if you just have stars and planets. But if you add biologies to them, now the local temporal manifold explodes with unimaginably profuse temporalities, world lines, relationships, intelligence, evolution. So that's what's been going on around here for a long, long time. We think presently the universe's age has been upgraded to 27 billion years. We think life on Earth is perhaps 3.456 billion years old. The age of the universe cannot be reasonably imagined if we think in terms of world lines rather than flat time. And part of the reason why we think in flat time is that we're trained to by things like clocks and calendars and so on. Einstein gave us the insight we needed to step outside of that, but we were more interested in energy because we could measure it. Now, we can measure certain features of the temporalities of organisms or even perhaps minds. But we were uninterested in them because it doesn't seem useful for war, and we're much more concerned about building machines that utilize energy. So the number of events that take place in a tree over some span of time, let's say an hour, as you can imagine, the tree appears stable to us because we're on the surface of the Earth. But if you were outside the Earth, the tree would be spinning around the Earth. So it's actually moving very quickly in at least 3 other dimensions, right? Again, the tree would make a spiral as the sun drags the Earth and the tree through interstellar space. It would make a spiral. Its tunnel would be tree-sized, tree-shaped, but along its length, it would be a spiral. And it would go from, over its lifespan, it would go from a seed to a sapling, right? It would change its size. It would change the bubble shape of the temporal unique thing that the tree is. So the tunnel would start out as seed-sized and would eventually become tree-sized, and then eventually would fall apart and disappear. Though it will have probably produced many seeds and perhaps some other trees. The world line is the shape of the tunnel over extended time and the events that occur inside it. So each of the organisms is a very specially privileged local mode of time-space. And all the things that happen in and between the organisms produce new forms of time. And they do this primarily by dividing a unity and then reunifying it. Right? So you can see that this is how reproduction works, right? In many animals, the male and the female are separated. Their reunion produces a child, and this goes on, right? So what you get when you diversify your organismal basis is a vastly richer temporal field for organisms to thrive, prosper, and evolve within. And I would argue, or suggest at least, that Earth is an incredibly special planet, even if there are many other living planets in time-space. The astonishing diversity of life here, and you've had 4 million years where octopuses could just evolve, And by the way, if you want to figure out how old octopuses are, you have to account for all the lives of all the octopuses, right? If a single human year is 8 billion human life years, but an octopus lifespan is, in some cases, around 7 months, you can see that the lineage age of the octopus is probably thousands of billions of years. Many times the flat age of the universe. Ridiculous, like geometrically larger, logarithmically enormous. A single housefly, the physicalized intelligences that comprise a housefly, are probably, the lineage age of one housefly is probably around, these are guesses, but they're based on some math I ran. It's probably around 185 quadrillion life years, if flies experience time at the same rate we do. Fly lifespans tend to be between 3 and 20 days, so it's quite likely that they're experiencing time at a different rate. But those creatures are incredibly old, and they're perfectly evolutionarily suited for this planet, as each of the organisms here is. Unfortunately, there's an exception, which is that the humans have 2 extra dimensions in which they can evolve. One of them is representational cognition, language, concepts, and so on. And one of them is technology. And in these 2 layers, we evolve faster than organisms can adapt to, right? An example is, given enough time, creatures and animals can probably adapt to situations introduced by humans that are not immediately lethal, though some of the things the humans introduce are immediately lethal, and essentially that puts a cork in the evolutionary temporalities, complex evolutionary temporalities that a given organism represents. So for example, unless there's humans everywhere in Africa, say 30,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, whatever, the tigers can adapt to bows and arrows and spears. They have a large enough population that they can probably adapt. Doesn't mean they won't be killed by arrows and spears, they will, but their gene line, their species form will probably survive. There's an old story about jaguar hunters in South America, and I guess sometime in the late 1800s, colonist guys started showing up there with guns wanting to hunt jaguars. And the jaguars had recognized the guns. This is a little bit like the opposite of what I'm saying. The jaguars had recognized the guns and learned how to hunt the humans that were carrying guns successfully. So guys that went down there with guns ended up in, graveyards, mostly, probably with a few exceptions. And the old jaguar hunters taught them how to hunt jaguars with spears. So this is an exception to the argument I'm forming here. This is a situation where, for a time, when guns were first introduced into the jungles of South America, jaguars could adapt, right? Now, once it became a big proposition, 10 guys with guns and so on, those animals are not going to be able to continue to adapt. So eventually what happens is the humans introduce technology, poison, hunting, guns, environmental degradation, species obliteration. And so they're introducing like 12 evolutionary threats at a time. And under those circumstances, the tigers will fail. They'll become extremely rare for a short time and then they'll disappear. The humans, by introducing into the biosphere the modes of time that are associated with machines and representational cognition and the peculiarly deadly human relationship with RepCog, create a situation where the complex ecologies cannot adapt fast enough. I mean, you can't adapt to burning down the Amazon, right? There's no way to adapt to something that just obliterates hundreds of trillions of anciently conserved relationships in a biological paradise, right? And unfortunately, this is what the modern humans at the group level are completely committed to proceeding with. Now, this supposes that the staggering velocity of human technological evolution is survivable by us. It isn't. You can't burn down the anciently conserved biological nurseries. What the humans are actually doing is they're shredding a resource they don't see. They are destroying the intricately complex and symbiotic temporal manifolds, right? Time structures in relation and biology that the organisms ordinarily repair just by existing. All they have to do to repair it is exist, right? They don't have to do anything special. They don't have to complete a special mission. Their reproduction is helpful. Just by existing, the anciently conserved ecologies heal and enrich the temporal manifold of Earth. And this is something you'll probably hear from zero other people because they just don't think about biorelational time. They have no reason to turn their curiosity in this direction. So when we introduce technology, what we're actually doing is we're ripping that manifold apart and we're making mechanical time happen in a biorelational context. It wouldn't be too dangerous out in space, but local to a living planet, we have to kill to fund all the machines. We have to tear stuff down. In space, the heat of machines would be relatively harmlessly offloaded, and whatever their temporalities are would at least be separate from the living planet so that they would not affect the temporal manifolds here. Now this brings up questions like, all right, I have to keep my thread straight. Okay, so our representational cognition inclines us to see the world as objects, things. Commodities, we use tokens to refer to stuff. The name for that object there is a tree, but it's seen as an object. It's rarely seen as a being. Sometimes it's seen as an organism, but nobody finds those terribly interesting because they don't... What do? Right? They just live. So the humans live, most of us, in a conceptual world that's dead inside. In the same way our cars and most of our houses are. It's as if we're trying to import space, dead, like interstellar space, which may not be dead actually, but it's death for organisms. It's like we're trying to bring space down to the surface of the Earth and obliterate the atmosphere and the environment and all the living beings and so on. We're that confused as a species. Now, individual humans differ, sometimes dramatically, but something appears to capture us at the group level, and it seems to be a result of representational cognition. And our peculiar vulnerability or inclination to represent things we're no longer going to enact relationships with words, dollars, images, billions of little objects, and so on. So we have this problem, and it's very contagious among us. I call the things that capture us thrisps, because it turns out that human minds form a network. The network's like an environment. In the environment, these processes become virulently contagious, and they take over whole populations of humans. So at the group level, we're extremely vulnerable to this danger that, again, we don't have very good concepts for. We sort of have the concept of a meme from Richard Dawkins, though the word predates him dramatically. And we have used the word viral to describe media that spreads quickly, but we don't realize that our minds are effectively infested with little chunks of representational cognition, thrisps, which comprise ideas about identity, value, relational opportunity, threat, and so on. So we have this highly structured library of thrisps in most of our waking thought, and our cultures and nations are almost entirely run by them. And most of the machines we make are actually expressions of these processes. The introduction of technology, especially the way that it's used and built on our world, creates a race, an evolutionary race. It's a race against the clock where you try to heal the temporal and relational and biological membranes, but they keep getting torn down faster and faster. And eventually that leads to a collapse of some kind. For sure, not maybe. We're literally stealing the future to fund the present with our machines. And we're not really funding anything very useful or helpful or amazing. Mostly what we're funding is defection from intelligence, human potential, prodigy, creativity, love, recognition of living beings. We're pretty much just defecting as hard as we can from that as a species and tearing down the anciently conserved ecologies, which are literally the most precious and astonishing resource imaginable. You know, think about planets in Timespace. Nearly all of them we would need, like life would need mechanical assistance to exist on, right? Almost all of them. If there are trillions, most of those trillions, they don't support life, right? So you need machines just to live there. We have a world where you don't, so far. intelligent beings, especially beings who were native to timespace or had interstellar or intergalactic networks, would understand and recognize the precious value of the Earth, at least around here, because it causes forms of coherent time, literally biological time, evolutionary time, intelligent time, and so on, that are unimaginably rare, even where they exist. And even if many of them exist, each unique living planet is it's more valuable than as if it were the only one. It turns out that the hyperstructures the biologies make in time forge a resource that humans have no language for. So it's clear that if there are non-human intelligences involved with Earth, and I will argue that there certainly are and have long been, they would recognize both the priceless value of the living planet here and the capacity to acquire temporal resources from such planets of various kinds. And they would probably be far more concerned with the health of the biosphere than they would be interested in humans particularly. Though there might be some exceptions to that as well, because whatever we mean by non-human intelligences is a vast library of different phenomena. But yes, our world is precious, and the introduction of technology creates a situation where we're not aware that, just like all the other organisms on Earth, we must compete against the technologies we establish. Automobiles and war machines and billions of packets of ketchup per day and 4 billion electronic still images per day and 12 billion video images per day, and all of these things must cost life, right? So just like the tiger facing colonial hunters with rifles, we're in the same situation. We're just very peripherally aware of it. Our technologies will quickly outcompete us. In terms of their need for what we would think of as resources, such as electricity. And all of the technologies have an entropy footprint. They offload entropy into the environment. From what I can tell, the organisms... Okay, so this gets to another topic. I suspect that there's a constant, much like the constants we're aware of in physics, which is the amount of mechanical activity and or computation you can get away with without damaging the structure of time on Earth. So there's some number that represents something like calculations per second per area in a manifold of biological time embedded in that manifold, where if you stay under that number, it doesn't damage local temporality much or at all. If you go over that number, it starts fucking up time in a really serious way. And the evidence for that damage would be desynchronization of biological processes, particularly in humans, since we make the technologies and are most exposed to them in many cases. So you can see there's a very complex problem at play here where our machines and computers are offloading a kind of entropy that reduces the capacity of biologies to form coherent temporal relationships and thus produce the modes of time that emerge from those relationships. So just to go back over some of the concepts, organisms are a mode of time-space. They're an extremely special mode. In the vastness of space, they are incredibly rare, apparently. Even if two things, even if there are a large number of other living worlds, space is vast. Right, you got 100 light years of no biology between us and Alpha Centauri. The other possibility is that there are forms of life that have learned to survive in interstellar space. And then there's even further possibilities that there are non-physical forms of life and or intelligence that are intrinsic to the nature of space-time, or exist above that manifold and influence its behavior from above, from a position of origin. Yeah. But those are very rich, complex topics. So organisms are a mode of space-time. Interior to organisms and exterior in their relationships, they create modes of time that are exceptionally rare in the extended context of the universe. And when you get billions of them on a living planet, they weave an invisible dimension of biological temporalities that is unimaginably sophisticated, profound, and profuse. And I think organisms can get around the constant of mechanical computation so that all of their activities tend to repair and enrich the local temporal environment. Because they're not doing mechanical processes. Eliminative materialists will say the metabolism of a cell is nothing but a mechanical process. They're not entirely wrong, but you can't dismiss the biological context. It's meta to mechanics, at least from this important perspective. So I'm concerned about things like artificial intelligence, a topic I visited in a number of previous recordings, and one that is is evolving with incredible rapidity. You can see the logarithmic spiral here, where you get a system that can barely play Go. 6 months later, it can adequately play the game. 2 months after that, it can beat any human player, with few exceptions. You can see how in computation it's possible to establish a very high self-accelerating rate of development. But if those machines are damaging the basis of life on Earth, which it can reasonably be argued nearly all of them are, in catastrophic ways that even if we ignore my temporal perspectives, are still lethal, then we will fail to outcompete our own technologies in very short order. Scarcity will produce war. And at this point, even without scarcity, you have war of various kinds, not all of it military. But yeah, we'll tear down the ecologies that are healing the manifold locally and enriching it, not realizing that those ecologies are literally our own body in time-space. Although we share related world lines with them, but it's also very important to count from the unity down to the distinct parts. And to understand the risk for our planet, we have to start with all of life here, and whatever may be involved with it or influencing it that we don't yet understand. So any damage to the ecologies lands in us in a dimension that we're mostly not aware exists. And it's the biorelational dimension of time and evolution, as we presently understand it, somewhat poorly. All right, so I'm going to close that topic there and start a new thread. In thinking a lot lately about UFOs, UAPs, aliens, I've read Diana Paluska's book, which is excellent, American Cosmic. And I've spent a great deal of time reading and studying and watching what the humans are gabbing about around this topic, mostly on Reddit, our aliens, our UFOs, and our experiencers. And I've engaged in a few conversations there. The problem is we're facing... So this goes back to the structure of the universe, identity itself, what things and beings are. And in our lexicons we have root concepts. The ultimate root is what I refer to as the uniphore, or the supercontainer. And for us that's usually the universe, or for religious people perhaps creation. Right? It's the space that we think contains all phenomena. And so all phenomena inherit necessarily the features and omissions of our uniphore, our supercontainer. If I say the universe is all created by God, then everything that I see inherits that quality. It's all created by God. There's nothing else to do any creating, if creating is going on at all. If I say there is no God, the universe is a mechanical process, all other processes necessarily inherit the omission, right? And also the perspective on function that arises from a position such as that one. So while we're facing... good evening.
Good evening.
While we're facing the radical stories that we're hearing, literally at a Senate hearing here in the United States, that the U.S. military is and has long been in possession of non-human biologies, vehicles of some kind, probably a non-ordinary kind, technologies that are advanced vastly beyond anything we can even imagine, and materials, and that they've been conducting a frenzied disinformation campaign since at least 1945, something around there, and trying to deny the reality of the phenomena. And it's a broad range of phenomena, it's not just one thing. So in hearing this news, we may choose to believe or disbelieve it, and we may choose some degree of belief or disbelief. Personally, it seems to me incredibly likely that what we've heard from David Grush is true, in the sense that there are such projects to retrieve crashes, reverse engineer technologies, build those technologies, employ them. There are bodies of some kind. It may not be that those bodies are ordinary organisms the way that we are, or seem to be, or think we are. There are materials, and there's been a long disinformation campaign in which noise was consistently introduced into the channel, disinformation was intentionally introduced into the channel, and so on. So I take most of that as being very likely to be real. The nature of the phenomena itself is very sophisticated. It involves myth, religion, psychology, media, the government, military, psyops, hoaxes, disinformation, witnesses, and their whole life, history and situation and so forth. So just on the surface, it's at least as complex as that. And if we get down to questions like, what the hell are these things that we see in the sky, and sometimes on the land, and sometimes people encounter beings, or at least they report it, and some percentage of those reports must not be invented, right? It's not just an invention. And there's a very interesting problem here, but before I get to that, sorry, I was distracted by somebody's security nonsense. Okay, so the phenomenon itself being, what are UFOs? Well, you can't really ask such a simple question, because what you have is some kind of a sphere of which different slices of that sphere represent different phenomena, or different slices of the sphere can be viewed from different perspectives that change the identity of the phenomena in our thought. That second thing is something I'm really interested in. The first thing is useful, we're all familiar with it, we call it disambiguation, right? What is that? The problem here is that whatever the range of phenomena that qualify as UFOs represent, they do not represent things that fit into our regular categories, mostly. A few of them might be biological. It could be that there are creatures that travel through space and fertilize living planets, enter the atmosphere, drop off some material, depart, possibly. There could be higher dimensional phenomena involved, where the actual nature of the thing, we would need a new category to understand it at all. We would have to establish a category that was, for example, partly ambiguous, meaning mysterious and unknown, or unpredictable, partly mysterious, partly intelligent, and conceivably partly biological. Right? So we would have to make up a word and invent a new category, and if we did that, all the other categories would inherit features from it. And we would realize, wait a minute, ordinary experience is actually like this. Like, the mystery part is, why am I here at all? Right? You may have a verbal answer for such a question, it probably doesn't encompass why you're actually here. So in a weird way, we ourselves, most of us, isn't human, right? We are the universe, we are this solar system's history, we are this sun, this world, this moon, her relationships. Then we are beings, then we are organisms, then we are animals, then we are human. Tiny little piece of us is human, not the whole thing by a long shot, but the way we use our categories is fairly blinding, and mostly ignorant and anthrocentric, meaning human-centered, as if we're, we think the universe orbits us. Whatever group us might refer to. So, one problem is the phenomena are probably non-ordinary. And so they have an ambiguous aspect that responds to how you relate with it. They have a mysterious aspect. There's an aspect of intelligence. There are probably aspects of what we refer to as physics, even though I think we're very primitive so far with that knowledge. And there may be aspects of biology involved. But what we're almost surely not looking at most of the time is creatures from another planet in a vehicle visiting us. It's at least reasonably possible that some of that is true, meaning that some slice of the sphere represents that. I gather or suspect that it's a relatively small part of the sphere. Something much stranger appears to be going on. And the problem with that is that it will shatter our holophores, right? It will change what it means to be, it will change the meaning of the universe in our minds. It will change the meaning of the sky. It will change the meaning of our origin, the meaning of our nature. It will change the identity of everything because it's in a position so close to the root of our ladder of identities that everything will inherit what we include and omit from our understanding if we are indeed told. I guess we're waiting to be told by our government, but it's very clear that the government's not highly motivated to make any such admission. And so what's happening now is that the people themselves are going after the data directly in various ways and will form their own beliefs. Even if the government were to say, yes, it's true, these things that have been said. We have ships, there are bodies, it's been around a long time, maybe forever. They probably still won't be able to say what the nature of the phenomena is because they probably don't very clearly understand it. I mean, how good is the military at understanding things? Its primary goal is asymmetric advantage over adversaries. So, its capacity for understanding must be incredibly limited. And if that's the organ of our culture that we're that's face forward to this phenomena, we're going to get garbage back, right? They're going to be just concerned about, can we build weapons with what we learned from them? Are they a threat to us? Can we repel them? This kind of thing, most of which would be nonsensical to any actually intelligent civilization at all. They would have none of those concerns. But the humans are mostly captured by this strange colonizing and colonialist lexicon, right? What things are, what they're for, what we do, what they do, what we do at them, what we do to them, what we do with them. And that's a path that will lead to catastrophe, literally the stars falling, for humans and probably most of life on Earth. We must form intelligent societies somehow, even if it's at a very small level. In any case, the way that the military would disambiguate the phenomena would be a military viewpoint. That's very dickish, knife-like, penetrating, piercing. They want to penetrate the phenomena. And I would argue that if we wanted to reach out to non-human intelligences, one of the better cohorts among our societies would be the science fiction authors. Right? They're like the opposite of a knife. They absorb. They have insight. They transform. They transcend ordinary thought naturally. So I think they would be the best, one of the best cohorts we could, face forward if there were to be contact, intentional contact between our species and non-human intelligences, whatever those may be. And I suspect they're complex. There's probably some biologies, but I think they may not be merely physical beings. So then, are they angels? Are they demons? These questions come up. Are they both? What is an angel? What is a demon? So the humans, again, were lexically crippled. We're missing concepts that would allow us to understand much more freely the complex nature of phenomena that we experience all the time, let alone phenomena that are non-ordinary to our experience. And one of the insights I had, so this gets back to another topic, which is disambiguation versus intelligent reambiguation. When we look at a phenomenon, we start throwing things away. We start figuring out what it isn't. Doctors do the same thing. It's called differential diagnosis. They quickly collapse the many-bubbled bubble, the manifold of identity, right, down towards something. And if you're looking at something and you can't tell what it is, you try to collapse it a couple different ways, and if that doesn't work, you try some other ways, or you get a closer look, or you keep, or you run away in terror because it's pretty scary in those first few moments when you don't know what something is. Right? But intelligent reambiguation adds bubbles after subtracting some. So we throw 4 or 5 away, we add 2 or 3. We throw 7 to 10 away, we add 12 more. And reambiguation is what actual intelligence and insight looks like. Insight isn't about what's true, necessarily. Insight is about perspective. Getting a perspective that gives you much greater freedom of further perspective rather than collapsing it to a given and ending the process. We ask certain questions like, what time is it? Okay. That's a question for which we expect a prosaic answer. It's 8:37. But there's a lot of other meanings to time. We could ask the question, what is the character of the local temporality over the past few days? This would be a question that doesn't have that kind of answer. In thinking about time, I had to re-ambiguate intelligently features of what I'd been taught and told until I could see from an entirely unique perspective that would otherwise have been barred from me. That perspective is so profound, if you change one of the roots of consciousness or meaning, like time, it changes everything. So from that perspective, you get all kinds of new degrees of liberty, new perspectives, and you'll generate more insight. So I realized maybe a month and a half ago, though I always do this in my mind, I couldn't really talk about it, that it's the intelligent reambiguation of phenomena and identity that leads to insight. Now I want you to think with me for a moment about the last time you encountered a phenomenon that you didn't know what it was. Or maybe a few times. And I want you to think particularly of something that remained unknown even after you tried to determine its identity. So take a moment and recall in your imagination, in your memory, some times when, or one specific experience where you couldn't tell what was happening or what something you were looking at was. It's funny, I was with a friend some months ago, and he left his guitar at my house, so he went back to his house nearby, and I picked up his guitar and brought it over there, and I had permission to, enter his house and stuff. So I thought, well, I'll just take the guitar over there and hang it up where he keeps it. And I walked in his back gate, and then into his garage. And just after I'd gotten into the garage, he came out the garage door, not expecting to find anyone there, or anything there. I just inhaled an insect. And for a moment he was shocked, and then I saw him go through transitions very, very rapidly. All this happened in probably less than 2 seconds. First he was startled. Then I saw him prepare for combat, right? Because the first derivation was intruder. Yeah. And then slowly, more slowly, he recognized, for example, that I am holding a guitar. Very unlikely an intruder would be holding a guitar. I am holding his guitar. Oh, I am his friend, Darren. But in the beginning, he didn't know what I was, or what I represented. And we all go through this process, particularly if we see something that we do not succeed in determining what it is. And the fact that we can look up in the sky and see something flying in a strange fashion and call it a UFO doesn't help us determine what it is, because UFO just means mystery, right? It's an unknown thing in the sky. There was a film recently of a volcano going off in South America, perhaps in Argentina or Brazil, can't remember. And there were like 20 objects that flew in a line-like pattern out from the exploding cone of the volcano into the sky. They were brightly lit. don't know what that is. And when you encounter something that you don't know what it is, there's a very surprising array of transitions that happen inside us, so to speak, at least in consciousness and in our psyches, and in our emotions, and in our minds, and in our bodies. So the insight that I had was that when I encounter something that I don't know what it is, I suddenly don't know what I am. And that could be extremely useful, right? To be free for a moment of our ordinary, everyday thought, categories, suppositions, perspectives, to be suddenly thrust into the outer space of identity is very challenging, and it can be terrifying depending on how we, relate with what's happening, how we choose to respond, presuming we have any choice. There are certain kinds of events that impose this not knowing on us rather directly. Accidents are one of these kinds of events. Deaths are another. Births are another. But I had a couple of experiences here where I'm staying where I encountered something, a phenomena, that appeared biological. I could discern that at least this is a biological phenomena. It's an organism of some kind. But in both cases, I could not disambiguate it to determine what kind of what it was, right? I suspected in both cases they were insects, and they were, technically they were. But they were doing very unusual things, and very rapidly. So when I first looked at one of the phenomena, what I saw was a strange kind of humming blur. And I realized, I don't know what that is. And in that moment, I didn't know what I was. Because it turns out that we are who and what we are in relation to what we're experiencing. Not, as we suppose, in some continuous, well-known, structured fashion. And so when people think about UFOs or aliens or non-human intelligences, or if they see something in the sky, one time the night sky lit up far brighter than daytime. I was with 4 of my buddies. We're out in a field, 2:30 in the morning. And I felt heat, and all the shadows, everything just turned into white suddenly. And the only thing I could think of that could do that was a nuclear bomb. So I thought, oh shit, we're going to die right now. But after a few seconds of impossible brightness, I turned around, and what I saw was inexplicable to me. It was a large, glowing blue orb, slowly falling, much faster than if it had a parachute, but slowly descending toward the horizon. And it appeared to be encompassed by coruscating blue flames. It was not a meteor. It was falling too slow for that. It was not something attached to a parachute. It was falling too quickly for that. Some people have suggested it could be a military flare. I rather doubt it, because it would blind everything. We don't know what it was. And we all suffered terror in the face of it. The reason we suffered terror is that the appearance of this thing changes what we can and will be and become. And so there's this really interesting little pivot where when we encounter something, especially something significant, that we don't know what it is, then we don't know what we are either, because it shatters the previously held bias that our lexicons and catalogs of identities are complete and good enough and true and realistic, quote unquote, factual, and so on. Well, when you encounter something that doesn't fit in the catalog, suddenly you question the entire catalog naturally. Like, wait a minute, I thought this catalog had everything in it. This thing I'm looking at must be one of the things in the catalog. Nope. No, it isn't. In fact, the stranger truth is that nothing we are looking at belongs to the catalog. The catalog is a set of conveniences that we become habituated to expect from common experience. And mostly our experience, has representative tokens in our lexicons, in the catalog, and so we feel at peace. Right? We feel, I know what things are, but in fact, no one knows what anything is. We'd be much better off if we started from a position of not knowing, walk toward knowledge, then dissolve back into a position of not knowing, walk toward knowledge again. And this is probably how our minds used to work most of the time. If our right hemisphere were more active, so to speak, in our waking world consciousness, we'd always be half dreaming, which would mean that the part of identity and the way of relating with identity native to our dreaming minds would be present with us in our waking experience. And that part would introduce ambiguity, intelligent ambiguation, mystery, would help us to see beyond the traps of the catalogs that we were largely enslaved with. But yeah, so this is one of the most staggering insights I've had recently, is that my own identity is suspended during a situation where I can't yet tell, quote, what's going on, or, quote, what something is. And I would argue that we'd be much better off if we could intentionally just drop the entire catalog and rebuild it. Or drop it and see, right? Drop it and perceive, clear of the catalog, sense, know, feel, relate with, understand, without the intrusion of the representational mess that we inherit. Because truthfully, nobody knows what anything is. I mean, there are probably a few exceptions. I don't know what anything is, but I understand how the catalog works, and I use it all the time, and I'm just as addicted to it as anyone else. I mean, one example, it's kind of a dumb one with a machine, is a car is supposed to be a vehicle, but for most of the time, the car is just sitting there. What is a car when it isn't a vehicle? You could say, well, it's a potential vehicle or a machine. But if you came here from a place with no machines and you saw cars, you would be fascinated and possibly shocked, and you would desperately try to find a way to understand, what is that? And what I'm trying to say is that our relatively primitive models of identity are mostly wrong. They work and don't get us killed primarily because all the humans tend to relate this way. There's a representational layer in our culture, right, where all the humans relate as if everything in the catalog is true and correct, and we all agree about the names and the values in dollars and so on. It's a big game. It would be amazing to be able to see, without the biases the catalog imposes, And when we encounter something truly unknown, it might be a good idea to stay with the mystery for a minute and not just run through the habitual rabbit track, mouse track, labyrinth of collapse the manifold till you get a derivative that matches the catalog and then forget about it, right? Without the catalog, any phenomena is infinitely fascinating. With the catalog, most phenomena is just a representation. It's sort of dead inside. There's no way to relate with it. So part of what sometimes happens when the non-ordinary emerges in our experience is perhaps part of the dreaming mind wakes up, because it is well suited to deal with anything that it doesn't care about the catalog at all. Right? It, uses it in a simplistic way in the worlds that our dreaming mind invents and inhabits inside us at night. That is a person and so forth, but it's never merely a person. The tiger in a dream is never only a tiger, unlike in our waking consciousness. So I think if you think back over experiences you've had where you encountered something that you could not figure out what it was, and you were paying attention, you may notice that in the beginning of the experience, your own identity went into cloud form. Right? It didn't collapse. It expanded in an effort to include the possibilities suggested by the experience. And this is part of why when we study the topic of UFOs, we need to understand that it's not something that fits in the catalog. And it's something that will change the whole catalog because we don't even have a placeholder for it. Even if the placeholders of gods, angels, demons, even if those survive somehow our encounters with phenomena. It's been a great pleasure to walk and think together with you this evening. Again, I'm so grateful for this chance to learn and grow and see, and I'm trying to see better with the perspectives I've been able to establish in my endless quest to understand what it means to be alive, to be human, what the universe is up to, this world, what is she, who is she, sun, time, light, consciousness, and particularly language. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to time together again very soon. May your ways and dreams be wise and beautiful.